Hey guys, always a pleasure to...
Which is why Batman keeps it.
Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of faith or optimism, but is a fact of human history. Indeed, the greatest fact in human history.
Let's start with a bit of history. During the 5th century AD, a group of settlers landed on Easter Island. They brought with them chickens, rats, bananas, and sugarcane. But the 64-mile island was not without its own resources. It was home to thick forests of Chilean wine palm, fertile soil for farming, and plentiful seafood off the coast. The environment allowed for ample food production, and the population ballooned until their demand met that supply. A civilization formed swiftly, clans and ranks emerged, and religion became their primary means to enforce a hierarchy. The grand moai we are all familiar with then started to appear, and with each generation they became bigger, more grandiose, to appease their gods and reap larger harvests. However, moving these tons of stone required manpower and timber, much like the pyramids of ancient Egypt. The bigger the stone, the more workers there needed to be, and the more trees needed to be felled. In a sort of fervent madness, a mania of progress, the land became barren. Without any logic, the civilization had depleted their forests. Even when they saw only a final tree left standing, someone decided to chop it down. No wood meant no new boats, so no seafaring. No timber to build houses meant many lived in caves. And a soil without roots to secure it meant the fertile land they depended upon for farming was washed into the sea. Food depleted. Wars broke out. The fight for food was all that was left. Where once tools were the prominent artifact, now laid caches of spearheads. The civilization had fallen from an insatiable need for growth, for progress. They could have reined in their fervent building at any time, but instead they doubled down. By the end, there were more than 1,000 moai, one for every 10 islanders. I'd like to talk about one of my favorite books, Civilized to Death by Christopher Ryan. I'll be pulling from a few other sources, but Civilized to Death is a much-needed counter-argument to the tireless support of civilization, which Ryan termed the narrative of perpetual progress.
It's like, those who think the past is better have not read enough history.
We constantly hear how there's never been a better time to be alive. The medical advancements, the entertainment, the civility and safety of modern civilization. How could someone be so ungrateful as to deny our time's superiority? But a lot of that is bullshit. Purposely skewed information to fuel the NPP. To truly answer if we are indeed living in the best of times, we need to examine the full extent of the NPP, deprogram that, and then examine how life actually was before the advent of civilization. Look at these two posts. Depending upon how you view the world, you're going to relate to one of these more than the other. It should come as no surprise that the one on the right, the one seemingly void of ambition, is the more controversial of the two. It goes against a worldwide cultural narrative that is so ingrained in our minds that we are rarely aware of it. Like the smell of our own clothes, our brains begin to display amnesia to the fact. The NPP is the unquestioned goal of progress, and there's a very good reason it's unquestioned. Our world economy depends on it. Stephen Chu, a Nobel Prize laureate, recently remarked how the world economy is a pyramid scheme, and he's right. Healthcare and Social Security both rely on the assumption of continuing growth. There needs to be a constant influx of young workers to support the growing healthcare costs and retirement checks of the old. And without consistent baby booms, this isn't sustainable. It's projected that Social Security will run out of funds by 2035. The pyramid is more than intergenerational, though. It's the framework of civilization. Since the birth of agriculture, two facts have always remained true. One, that a population will rise until it reaches its maximum food production, and two, that a civilization will always become hierarchical with an upward concentration of resources. Taken together, this means that there will never be enough food for everyone, because even at max food production, the food isn't divided evenly, and this lack of food will be pervasive throughout a civilization's history. Let's take a generic example. When agriculture is adopted, far more food can be produced by a single individual. This means other individuals can now focus on other tasks, and suddenly we have a division of labor. Once a population becomes large enough, someone needs to keep all these individuals working in sync, and now you have a leader. The leader also needs to ration the food and protect it from theft, so now the leader has guards. The pyramid is pretty well formed already. The keeper of the resources, his army, and his peasants. The word lord actually comes from an Old English word I can't pronounce, which was derived from another Old English word I also can't pronounce, and it literally means the one who guards the loaves. The lord will most likely unevenly distribute the loaves to buy loyalty and insulate himself, thereby creating an artificial lack of food for those on the bottom of the pyramid. A perceived lack of food creates more farmers, which will make more food that again is unevenly distributed, and this cycle repeats endlessly. Growth becomes a necessity. America is only about 12 generations old, and look how insane the wealth distribution has become. There are ample resources, but many go hungry, many are homeless, so we keep trying to add to the bottom layer to boost our standard of living. Historically, America shipped in slaves to essentially add a whole new bottom rung to the pyramid, but now it's on a global scale. Currently, cheap labor from third world countries is what's bumping us up slightly higher in the pyramid. I've heard the argument that cheap labor is actually helpful for these individuals, but that's misconstruing the truth. The fact is, they were absorbed into the world economy, and although they would have been better off had that never happened, now that they are, yes, it'd be better for them to have these terrible jobs than none at all. The standard of living is increasing for a handful of people, but only at the expense of others. This standard can keep rising as long as the bottom of the pyramid keeps growing. However, we are nearing the peak of civilization. The peak, Ryan describes, is reaching maximum demand on the ecology. We have been borrowing from the future to boost today for a long time. In Ryan's words, instead of living off the interest of nature, we've been taking the capital, allowing for smaller and smaller returns. Aquifers are being exhausted, forests bulldozed, and with global warming, the entire ecosystem is hanging on by a thread. We're operating on the logic of Wimpy from Popeye.
I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today.
We can't expect that to slow down, though. The ones who guard the loaves have an interest in keeping the status quo. We could try to perfect what we have, give every working adult adequate food, shelter, and ample leisure time. But instead we keep progressing, traveling down a path towards some unforeseeable conclusion. If progress mainly betters the lives of the elite, why should we care to progress at all? To rise slightly within the middle of the pyramid? Why, like the Egyptians, do we even build pyramids? Tributes to rulers who didn't lift a finger building them. Americans seem to be the biggest supporters of progress. Steinbeck wrote, "Socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires." If your mindset is living high up in the pyramid, even if you aren't, then you believe in the status quo. Progress would benefit you, give you more. And more seems to be the name of the game. Malcolm Forbes said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." And many Americans seem to share that mentality. They view their lives as if it were a mini civilization.
My whole life has been winning. I mean, I've won.
How much land can they rule? How many resources can they accumulate? Will their McMansion or Tesla stand as an appropriate symbol of their greatness? Will it serve as their pyramid, their moai? In that mental narrative, that's the NPP doing its job. It's progress propaganda working. You don't need to agree with that sentiment, but you should be able to acknowledge the existence of the NPP. For after all, if the only defense for progress is that it makes our lives better, then our hunter-gatherer ancestors must have been miserable, right? Whenever someone laments how difficult modern times are, you are bound to get a few cliched responses. These usually dredge up debunked myths popularized by the NPP. The most common argument I encounter is that hunter-gatherers were starving most of the time. This is false. Perhaps they didn't have the excessive quantities as we do today, but their nutrition was superior. Hunter-gatherers rarely suffered from prolonged periods of starvation. Their style of living made it virtually impossible. Whereas the Irish suffered a terrible famine in the 1850s by putting all their money on the potato, hunter-gatherers in Syria had a portfolio of over 150 wild plants. If one plant failed, they had 149 more to choose from. This variation in diet also provided them with all the vitamins and minerals they needed. When maize became the staple of North America, anemia rates spiked because their diet lacked iron. Atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, cancer, obesity, all of these are heavily affected by diet, not to mention physical activity, which hunter and gatherers got plenty of. Our adoption of staple grains also eroded our dental health. Among hunter-gatherer remains in Sudan, scientists found less than 1% of them suffered tooth decay. Saying our diets are better off today is a false comfort, just to give you pride that you were born arbitrarily in the present, as opposed to during the other 99% of human history. We existed as hunter-gatherers for the vast majority of our evolutionary timeline. Our bodies adjusted to make that specific lifestyle work. Only for the past 12,000 years or so have we adopted agriculture, and evolution doesn't work that fast. Let's tackle some of the other popular arguments. People didn't live as long back then. You'd be dead by 30. Not true. The idea that hunter-gatherers had a reduced lifespan comes from a misunderstanding of statistics. The theorized low lifespan was calculated by averaging in infant deaths. Problems with birth were more frequent back then, and even when they were successful, if the infant had an abnormality, they would likely choose to end its life because they would be a hindrance to the tribe. If you include these outliers, the average skews lower, but humans, even back then, had the same lifespan. We approach 70 and then taper towards death. Humans back then and today have the same peak health of around 27 to 30. Statistics today are skewed the other way. If you're familiar with nursing homes, you're aware of how far we extend the lives of patients with a poor quality of life. Why are we counting hovering at the brink of death as being alive? Dying in hunter-gatherer tribes was handled more realistically. If someone could no longer be a part of tribal life, they would be left behind, or in some cases put to death. That might sound vicious, but so is performing extensive medical testing on 90-year-olds to siphon their money. Perhaps there's an argument that without modern medicine, you'd fall victim to disease. However, the majority of infectious diseases are only around because of civilization. That's because they are zoonoses, meaning they originally spread from animals to humans. Our domestication of cattle gave us the measles. Urbanization fostered a breeding ground for rats and thus fleas, and gave us the bubonic plague. And COVID-19 originated from a wet animal market. What does the most damage, though, is living in such close proximity to each other. When our hunter-gatherer ancestors did contract diseases, they were contained, isolated to a singular group of around 150 or so humans. Risk of infection was low. The last popular argument I hear is that life was more brutal back then. You were more likely to be murdered or eaten by an animal. Again, not quite. First off, there is little evidence to suggest life was more violent pre-agriculture. Hunter-gatherers would have been more averse to war. Without any immovable property, land or food to defend, tribes could easily pack up and simply avoid the conflict. There is far more evidence to suggest that violence spiked when agriculture began, as there were now resources that people fought for ownership of. This logic would also likely apply to intergroup violence. Hunter-gatherers were predominantly egalitarian. Women and children were not seen as property. When agriculture came along, women no longer had to contribute to the group's food supply, so they were delegated to solely raising children. And by the time of the Ten Commandments, it's clear women had become a sort of owned property. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Without the idea of ownership, it would be less likely to see males turn to violence over a mate. Consider the concept of partible paternity, which has been widely documented in South American tribes. This states that a woman's child is the combination of all sperm received by mates up until the moment of her birth. This might give modern man anxiety now to not have ownership over his child, but thinking from an evolutionary perspective, this ensures better survival. This allows the child to have numerous fathers who will love and care for them. As for being eaten by an animal, well, look, you might get eaten by an animal, but our body actually evolved to help you with that. We produce endorphins under a situation like that, to make the whole act of dying gruesomely seem like a blurry dream. I am much more afraid of what a civilized human would do to me than any animal. Humans have a knack at torture. From ancient times to modern, civilizations in the name of war, religion, or superiority have been exceptionally creative with how to extract the most pain out of a human before they die. The idea that hunter-gatherers were more violent is just more propaganda from the NPP. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes wrote that the natural state of man without government or society was nasty, brutish, and short. And I imagine this outlook was around for a long time. It was likely born alongside agriculture. It's when we changed our relationship with nature. As hunter-gatherers, we thanked Mother Earth for her generosity, but as farmers, we found ourselves at war with her. Nature was something to triumph against, a soil we had to conquer, a forest we needed to clear. Controlling harvests makes nature your adversary instead of your inherent provider. I want to take a moment to dispel a few images I may have conjured inadvertently. 1. I'm not describing or idolizing tribes like the North American natives that the Pilgrims encountered. By around the 8th century, Indians were already operating complex social structures called chiefdoms. These mirror many of the same components of medieval kingdoms. The chief collected a tax, tribute, they built armies and went to war, and the position of power usually followed the bloodline. Secondly, try not to picture communism. Communism implies a structured equality, and hunter-gatherers were not that. There were those who were more valuable to the tribe, whether based on skill or just likability, and those who were less valuable. Hunter-gatherers were largely egalitarian societies. They believed in uncompromised individuality and freedom. You could choose how much you worked. You could choose to share none of your food. You could even choose to kill your tribe mate. The problem would be is that everyone is free to do so as well. And if you don't share your food with those who are starving, well, they certainly won't share theirs with you. There's a need to work together. It increases your chance of survival. There's a good reason we enjoy a group of friends, being on a team, or sharing food with one another. We are a highly social animal, and evolution has bred us that way. We survived for hundreds of thousands of years by forming bonds and working together. Work, though, didn't really exist back then. The concept of work really takes off with the division of labor. Before this, work was more like play. Only after the division of labor did work become a miserable fact of life. Peter Gray described foraging as an act of play due to 4 reasons. 1. The skills required varied, and there is room to become competent, thus taking pride in what we do. 2. It wasn't exhaustive. The time needed to forage, on average, was far lower than how much we work now. 3. It was a social activity, done with friends. And 4. It wasn't structured. There was no one forcing you to forage at any time. Any one of those qualities would make for an exceptional job in modern times. The reality is, for the majority of human existence, people had all 4 of those. Furthermore, they had freedom to be an individual. Consider how baffling it is that we can't enjoy certain beaches, a chunk of earth that's existed for millennia, because someone claims ownership.
Yoink!
Yoink!
Likewise, consider how preposterous it is that we can't enjoy psilocybin mushrooms, a natural plant, because another human thinks they're bad. When you start to think about how much of our lives are controlled and restricted, it becomes an unbearable exercise in frustration. And our eroded freedom comes with no justification. If some troglodyte down the road told you to get lost, you'd say, "Shut up, you don't own me." Yet if the troglodyte is born into a wealthy family, or God forbid runs your country, you have to say, "Yes sir, you own me." Because we are in essence owned by our government, and governments need a growing population to thrive. So, like you would if you owned a farm, you make all the proper choices you would to breed your domesticated animal. We are the cattle of government. Humans are what feed a civilization's growth, and they can never have enough. It's for this reason that religion since the beginning of civilization has demonized all sex that isn't for procreation. This is why abortion is fought against so passionately, because there needs to be more cattle. But we aren't even free-range cattle. Land is owned. We get crammed into pens whose size depends upon how far up the pyramid we are. I imagine many gut reactions to this could be, well, if you hate it so much, then leave. But we can't. There's no escaping civilization at this point. All resources of any value are all claimed. Natural wildlife is fenced off. We are stuck at this point. Even if as a singular unit, the entire world decided to end this crazy experiment of civilization, we couldn't. It's gone too far. There's too many people. You can't opt out of this experiment. Now, that's very depressing, and I don't want to end this on a complete downer. After all, I actually have a pretty hopeful outlook for my own life. So I'll give a personal anecdote. This video is recreating a sort of trilogy. When I first started this channel, I made 3 videos I felt very personally attached to. One about a video game, one a genre of horror, and the third a book that moved me. They represent a majority of what consumes my mind. I've covered the first 2, and this is the final installment. For this reason, and hopefully to give a few others something to relate to, I want to share how I escaped the hopelessness I felt navigating this world. I've sought treatment for depression a number of times in my life. I was treated with pills and therapy. During my sessions, I would explain what I believed were very logical reasons for being depressed. It was the lack of community, the inescapable slavery of unfulfilling work, and the constant erosion of my autonomy. It was that no one could point me in the right direction because no one had taken my path before. As hunter-gatherers, we'd have been doing the same thing for ages, and your ancestors could tell you exactly how to thrive. But there's no comfort from previous generations anymore, just hope that we will be able to navigate this changing world. I blamed civilization for my negative feelings, and most considered that absurd. They insisted these feelings were my own doing, that they stemmed from either my own negative thoughts that needed fixing with cognitive behavioral therapy, or by my brain that just needed the right medication. When I found a therapist who did concede that civilization was detrimental to my mental health, there was still no further discussion on the issue. For what could be done? Was he to change the world as we know it for my happiness? The best advice he could give me was to join a commune. I am highly antisocial. The thought of being in a community of strangers terrifies me, but the way I saw it, things couldn't get any worse. So anything would have to be better than continuing on miserable. I packed up and left. I drove from New England to Texas, a pit stop to see old friends, and then to Montana to join a wilderness group. I lasted 2 or 3 nights. I remember sitting in a teepee by myself, trying desperately to keep warm in front of a fire, and then suddenly something clicked. I realized that since I had set out on the road, I felt not depressed. I realized that I didn't need to be forcing myself to do this, to join a group of strangers, something I know I didn't like. I had already found a solution. I just needed to break out of my pen, reclaim my autonomy. So I set back out on the road. For 3 months, I slept at rest stops, Walmarts, truck stations, and free campsites. I visited local bars, I talked to strangers, I explored offbeat locations, visited national parks, napped in fields. I had the best adventures of my life, some exciting, others terrifying, but many, frankly, boring. But when I would pass the night away by sitting in a parking lot listening to the radio, I felt at peace. I even felt like I wouldn't mind having a 9-to-5. I wouldn't even mind working at the very Walmart I was parked outside of, because I knew I didn't need to. It was optional. If I could be content living a nomadic lifestyle out of my car with odd jobs here and there to not starve, I was as close to autonomous as I'd ever be. Years later, I'm in a very different situation. I'm not living out of my car, and I'm far from autonomous, but I'm working towards it. I think the only reason I'm better now is because I know that if civilization breaks me again, I can just live in my car and be happy. I really don't need much to be happy, but every day since I returned from my road trip, every day that I continue being a part of civilization, I become a little more materialistic, a little more dependent on creature comforts, and a little more depressed. A lifestyle with little security won't be appealing to most, but the takeaway is to find your baseline. Find out how much of your life is just fat, meaningless crap you accumulate or do to fill a happiness void. Less fat means less of a reliance on income, and therefore more autonomy. I'm an extreme example. I prefer to live lean. But who knows? We are all subjects a part of this experiment of civilization. We've never been this developed. We don't know where things will go. Will we all fall like the subjects of Easter Island, or will we transcend to something greater? I know as much about what will happen to civilization as I do about what will happen to myself. I don't wish for everyone to be as frustrated as I am with how things are. I'd just like the illusion of progress to wear off. I think there's a profound sadness in believing life is about how many toys you can own before you die.